I think there's a world in which you can replicate the effects of battlefield air interdiction with precision long-range fires. And that's important. And when they do these longer range strikes into Russia, they should be going after important objects that are operationally critical to sustain Russian forces close to the front lines. And so when you strike a depot, when you strike an oil refinery, when you strike these sorts of objects, they just shouldn't be sort of random events that happen on a Tuesday. They should be done in space and time because the Russian forces fighting at the front line depended on that stockpile like that day, or they will depend on it in 2 weeks, but it's not there, and it's sewn together in such a way that it facilitates your ability to try to break through.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Jabot. And this time we are talking to George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War. George is the Russia and Geospatial Intelligence Team Lead. He advises senior military and political decision makers, and he's a regular here on Frontline. George, good to see you again. Welcome back.
Hi, Kate. Good afternoon. So wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Well, let's start, George, on the battlefield in Ukraine. And what is your understanding of the Russian military preparations for new offensives there, be it in Sumy, Kharkiv or Zaporizhia areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, we have a lot of discussion right now about a possible future offensive in northern Ukraine, but I want to correct the discourse here. We have an ongoing Russian offensive in Sumy Oblast. Of course, as you know, the Ukrainians were operating in Kursk Oblast up through March, and then the Russians largely expelled the Ukrainians from Kursk and then subsequently began their offensive into Sumy. So we are currently in the midst of an ongoing Russian offensive in Sumy. So I think it's a little bit of a misnomer to describe a potential future offensive in Sumy. So that's ongoing. Now, that said, there's an estimated 125,000 Russian troops on the opposite side of the international border in Kursk and Belgorod oblasts. And it is very possible that the Russian command may commit those forces to ongoing operations in Ukraine's Kharkiv or Sumy regions in order to intensify those operations. But that said, this northern part of Ukraine, Sumy and Kharkiv, that's actually, in my assessment, likely a supporting effort or a secondary effort for Russia's big 2025 campaign season. The primary focus area, the main effort for Russia's 2025 summer campaign season is going to be in, of course, the eastern Ukraine in the Donbass, and specifically near Konstantinivka in Donetsk Oblast. Konstantinivka is a significant town, an operationally significant town, just west of Bakhmut, west of Chasiv Yar, and it appears that the Russian command is currently setting conditions for a pitched battle against the city this summer. We know this because the Russians have redeployed Russian divisions, such as the 20th and 150th Motorized Rifle Divisions, away from their previous priority effort, the Pokrovsk direction, where Russian forces were stuffed and did not actually manage to seize Pokrovsk, but they've moved away from that direction towards Konstantinivka. And it appears that the Russians would like to assault that city from multiple directions, from both the south and the east, and potentially the northeast as well. So we are currently watching potential Russian preparations for that battle.
And what do you think would be the catalyst for that push there?
So, look, the fight in the east has been interesting to look at for the last 12 months. The story of the last 12 to 18 months has been that in early 2024, the Russians achieved a tactical breakthrough near Avdiivka. They managed to seize the settlement. And then since then, they spent the majority of 2024 trying to get to Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk was the Russian self-stated operational objective for their summer 24 campaign season. And the Russians advanced in the course of a year about 55 kilometers and got up to the outskirts of Barros, but didn't actually get to seize that town itself. That campaign, in our assessment, culminated around February, March of this year. And what the Russians are now doing is they're looking for new opportunities. They're trying to find new soft spots in the line that they can push on where they can make inroads. And it appears that the Russian command currently assesses that they can make some inroads slightly to the north near Konstantinivka. So that is, in our assessment, why the Russian command decided to pull some of those divisions and prioritize this different area of the theater. The catalyst is Putin needs to continue making gains on the map. In our assessment, the center of gravity for this war is not indeed what happens on the battlefield. Neither side can conduct operational maneuver. All the maneuver is tactical or sub-tactical. the true center of gravity for this war is the political will of the international coalition, particularly the United States, and their willingness to continue backing Ukraine. Now, for policymakers and decision makers, the easiest and most intuitive metric to be able to understand the ebb and flow of the war is to look at a map and to see where do the lines change, how does it change over the last 3 months, over the last 6 months. But it's an imperfect indicator. But for Putin, he can directly assault the political will if he can continue to conduct cognitive warfare and information operations that basically present these map changes where it moves marginally, and that is all meant to buttress a narrative that the Ukrainians fundamentally are not able to sustain a defense. Russian battlefield gains are inevitable. The situation's always getting worse. But of course, what's lost in that context is, of course, that the Russians are making these genuinely small gains at enormous military losses that are not operationally sound. And so I think what the Russian command is doing is, having been stuffed in Pokrovsk, they're now looking for new opportunities. Where can they continue to push the lines? Where can they continue assaulting the true center of gravity of this war?
And do you believe that Putin has an objective, a point on that map, on the battlefield, before he'll actually consider talks about ceasefire? Or is he simply in a position that he actually has no intention of doing so if he can keep fighting the war?
So the Russians are quite clear on what their intent is, because they tell it to us explicitly all the time. And they, at a bare minimum, demand at least 4 regions of Ukraine, none of which the Russians fully control. But so they're going to keep warfighting until they achieve that, and they're not willing to accept anything lower than that. But I am actually prepared to make the argument that Russia's actual desired suite of concessions go beyond the stated objectives. Because in recent weeks, senior Kremlin officials have been increasingly invoking the term Novorossiya, or New Russia, which is a invented geopolitical construct that encapsulates all of Ukraine's southern and eastern oblasts, which includes, by the way, Kharkiv, which includes Poltava, which includes Mykolaiv and Odessa. And so for the Russians to go out and say that they need to, defend Novorossiya, that of course goes much further across the current 4 oblasts that they are explicitly and have officially put claims on. And beyond that as well, the Russians are also making claims unofficially and informally to all of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin the other day made a reference to, the 1,000 years of Russia, 1,000 years of the Rus. That's, of course, a reference to the medieval state of the Kievan Rus, from which modern-day Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia all have tied their origins to. But what Putin's really doing is making an ancient claim to Kiev in such statements as well. And so, I believe that President Trump and the Americans, and having engaged Putin and the Russians directly, and the American side officially stating that we've hit an impasse, we have, through brute force discovery, confirmed what should be obvious, which is the Russian demands are non-starters, and they are not interested in negotiating anything other than Ukrainian and American terms of surrender.
And do you think that the longer that pause in getting any progress in the ceasefire, the more it feeds Putin's ambitions to demand more and to be more open about what he wants in terms of territorial gains?
That's a great question. So we've got a 2-part answer. I believe Putin has become more explicit with his demands as the negotiation process has protracted. Because when Steve Witkoff, the special American advisor who was the envoy engaging in direct bilateral negotiations with the Russians on the behalf of the Trump administration, whenever Steve Witkoff would return to Washington, we would actually then see Russian ministerial revelations and statements saying, these are our demands. We are demanding not only the 4 oblasts, we're also demanding these various things of NATO. They wanted to roll back NATO's borders back to 1997, its 1997 borders, and these other things. And I think the reason why is because as Witkoff was going back to Washington, Witkoff was relaying things like, boss being President Trump, they only want these 4 regions, and if we just give them these 4 regions, then we're all good. This can be easy. And I think the Russians, actually reading that in the headlines, they actually then felt the need to go back and say, actually, no, yes, it's those four regions, but we've actually demanded the demilitarization of Ukraine. We've demanded regime change in Ukraine and so-called denazification of Ukraine. We have demands of the NATO alliance must go back to its 1997 borders, and so on and so forth. So I do think the protracted nature of the negotiations and initial American misunderstandings about the Russian demands, about not just Ukraine but also NATO, that's become more explicit for the Russians. Second part of the answer, as these negotiations protract, Putin's getting into riskier territory because Putin's efforts to try to sucker Washington into believing that there's a easy way out and this can all be sort of simply done if you just capitulate. I think Washington is starting to crystallize and receive that strategic clarity that actually, no, this isn't actually that simple. And so now we're at a fork in the road where either Washington decides to double down on supporting Ukraine, recognizing that what the Russians are asking for are unacceptable, and that essentially, if we walk away, it would be like Trump's Afghanistan, but just on a much worse scale. Alternatively, the Trump administration, out of frustration, realizes that they can't do anything about this. They'd rather not do anything about this, so the Americans pick up their toys and go home and leave Ukraine to the wolves. And I think Putin is trying to, as the negotiations protract, he is trying to shape the administration's thinking so that we go for the latter. We abandon Ukraine, we pick up our toys and go home, as opposed to continuing support in Ukraine.
And yet the Kremlin is still dangling that carrot with those talks in Istanbul on Monday. What will they be trying to achieve from that in terms of influencing the American attitude towards them?
I believe the Russians are trying to buy time. They're trying to convince the Americans that negotiations can still be had if we just make the proper concessions and so on and so forth. But we've seen this song and dance before. Need I remind the listeners that on the eve of this full-scale invasion beginning, there were a flurry of senior high-level Russian and American negotiations in Geneva and Switzerland in late 2020 and early 2021, where the American diplomats were trying desperately to try to negotiate with the Russians and evade the war. And we learned ex post facto that indeed the Russians had already made up their minds at that time. They were already going to invade. They were simply holding these meetings and negotiations to try to buy time and string the Americans along and dissuade the Americans from doing anything and extracting preemptive concessions, even though the Russians were going to invade anyhow. So, the Russians are very, very clear with their negotiating tactics. They're very snide negotiators. There's a famous Russian saying about how the Russians and the Soviets like to negotiate. What's mine is mine, and what's yours is up for negotiation. And I think it's going to be a continuation of that.
And yet, every time that Donald Trump seems to voice some kind of frustration about the lack of progress and the continued assaults on Ukraine, he doesn't do anything about the sanctions that he threatens. And this week, again, we had this kind of like veiled threat of a potential World War III from the Kremlin. Do you think that talk actually works in deterring Trump?
We will see. The Trump administration has not been willing to consider the sticks against Russia. We've tried to give them carrots. We've used sticks against Ukraine, but not yet sticks. And I believe that the theory is that the administration sees it as a measure of last resort if truly negotiations don't work, because they've been trying to bring the Russians to the table. We, of course, maintain the leverage. We maintain sticks. We maintain the ability to try to drive down the international price of oil, in particular by cooperating with OPEC. To really hit the Russian bottom line, especially if we can get the international price of oil to go below $60 a barrel. And so those veiled threats, I think, is Trump trying to lean into the language of strength and convince the Russians that actually we have things that we can do. And I view it as a positive sign, right? Because just last month, the U.S. and Ukraine ratified the agreement for the minerals deal, which creates a ledger which in principle should be used to facilitate military sales to Ukraine. There's a $310 million contract that's currently snaking its way through the American bureaucracy for the F-16 program. There was the first ever $50 million foreign military sale under the Trump administration to Ukraine, which was approved back in March of this year. And so I hope this is a sign that the American military equipment spigot is being gradually turned on. The threat of sanctions are on the table, and we just need the president to realize that indeed Putin thinks he can play Trump like a fiddle, but Trump is not going to take the bait.
Yeah, the reason I kind of asked that question about whether Trump is deterred by these kind of threats was because Fiona Hill, his former Russia czar, who before that was an intelligence analyst for the Bush and Obama administration, you're nodding like you know her, do you? Yes, personally, do you? Have you worked with her? She's no, okay. But she's quoted as saying that Trump is afraid of Putin. I'm wondering what if these threats stop working though on Ukraine's European allies like Germany, which are now becoming decidedly more bullish.
Yeah. So, the threats are really becoming quite tired because we've constantly seen the Russians threaten Armageddon. They've done it many times. It was an effective deterrent against decision makers in the Biden administration for a long time. And we all recall those sort of pitch policy debates that we had about do we or do we not send F-16s? Do we or do we not allow them to use ATACMS in Russia? So I do know that in terms of the consensus Washington legacy conventional wisdom, those sorts of threats have been quite effective. Now Trump's a bit of a maverick, and we'll see if it doesn't work. The Europeans, I believe, understand that it doesn't work. My general assessment is that the closer you live physically to Russia, the better you understand the reality of the situation. And the Europeans pay attention to Russia. Russia's their immediate neighbor, and they've seen this song before, they've seen this dance before, and more importantly, the Europeans understand, I think, better than the Americans do at certain times that look, mutually assured destruction and deterrence logic that kept us all safe and secure during the Cold War is still valid. That the Russians are using these threats and blackmail specifically in order to try to deter the West from decisively defeating Russia, because they actually don't have the conventional means to do so if the West indeed uses its superior resources to invest into Ukrainian defense.
And this week, the German Chancellor announced that restrictions on the range and use of Western missiles to hit Russia can be lifted, and that Germany will help Ukraine build its own long range weapons. What kind of weapons might he be talking about?
So, to be candid, I'm kind of confused by Mertz's statements. Um, it seems to,
Is it a veil for kind of hiding the fact that Taurus missiles are about to arrive, do you think?
I don't know, because perhaps, but Mertz has been pretty clear that they're no longer discussing sending Taurus at this time. I mean, that appears to be the current German position. So to say that there's no restrictions, but not deliver Taurus kind of seems like the apropos of nothing. Investment into Ukrainian long-range systems would be good because the Ukrainian defense industry is drastically underemployed. The Ukrainians can produce a lot more domestically, cheaply, using Ukrainian factories and Ukrainian labor. But the issue is just that they don't have the capital. They don't have the liquid cash to actually spin up their own production. And the Ukrainians, of course, have long-range drones. They have long-range missiles. They're working on systems that have ranges north of 500 kilometers. Some of them around 1,000 kilometers. And they're all, of course, in developmental stage, but they need that cash infusion to help bring them into maturation. As far as I'm concerned, if the Ukrainians can develop a system that can deliver a payload 500 kilometers effectively and cheaply, that might be preferable to a small number of Taurus missiles that Germany would send that would be several orders of magnitude more expensive.
And in the interim, how much more successful do you think Ukraine has been in being able to strike deep into Russia? It has been very successful in numerous disruptions to airports in the country, hasn't it?
So, yeah, look, the Ukrainians need the capability to be able to strike deep into Russia to hit legitimate military targets and objects. And they've hit some good military objects in Russia's deep rear. However, what I'd like to see more is a better Ukrainian strategy and a better concept of operations for how to use deep strikes. It seems that President Zelensky has a slightly misplaced strategy for how to use deep strikes. There seems to be this theory of victory that if the Ukrainians simply impose pain and impose costs through deep strikes, then that will change the Kremlin's calculus and they will therefore end the war. And in fact, that's not correct. What the Ukrainians need to do is impose conventional operational losses on the battlefield within Ukraine. And what the Ukrainians should do is use their deep strike campaign in support of the operational maneuver within the country.
How would you join those two up then, George?
So what you need to do is you have to replicate the effects of what we call battlefield air interdiction. So battlefield air interdiction is used. You typically use fixed wing aircraft for this, but what you do is you isolate a particular sector of the theater where you are conducting your operation. So no forces get in, no forces get out, make it impossible to do rotations, make it very difficult for logistics to be able to get in and service the area. And you do this by interdicting the roads, interdicting bridges, taking things out like that at the operational level depth. So I'm talking of a depth of well beyond 50 kilometers, 50 to 150 kilometers, that sort of thing. I think there's a world in which you can replicate the effects of battlefield air interdiction with precision long-range fires, and that's important. And when they do these longer range strikes into Russia, they should be going after important objects that are operationally critical to sustain Russian forces close to the front lines. And so when you strike a depot, when you strike an oil refinery, when you strike these sorts of objects, they just shouldn't be sort of random events that happen on a Tuesday. They should be done in space and time because the Russian forces fighting at the front line depended on that stockpile like that day, or they will depend on it in 2 weeks, but it's not there, and it's sewn together in such a way that it facilitates your ability to try to break through.
And is that because there's a lack of intelligence?
I don't know if it's a lack of intelligence or if it's insufficient operational planning. I suspect it's the lack of sufficient operational level planning. The Ukrainians really do need assistance in thinking about how to plan operations because sort of having that middle level staff to do that sort of planning is one of the growth areas that the Ukrainians need to keep working on.
If I could just return to that thought that was expressed this week by Dmitry Medvedev, the former president and deputy of Russia's Security Council, about World War III and the threat of it. And it's obviously empty threat to clear-sighted analysts who'd say, actually, World War III, some of them say, is already upon us because of Russia's clandestine attacks on critical infrastructure, sabotage, poisoning, and assassinations. Would you agree with that?
I'm not prepared to comment on that right now because, it's very difficult to say. I'll just make the observation that, when Imperial Japan attacked China in the early 20th century, several years before 1939, no historians that I'm aware of at the time described the Japanese adventures in China as being the beginning of World War II. Now, history in hindsight is 2020, and now modern historians will go back and say, I actually don't think World War II started in 1939. I think it actually began with the Japanese going into China, to Manchuria, and that's a mainstream take now. It's very possible that in a couple decades, once this is all over and we'll see what comes of this war, that if this is the catalyst for a larger war that then metastasizes, that yes, it's very possible that historians will go back and say, actually, when the Russians went into Georgia in 2008, or when the Russians went into Ukraine in 2014, that was actually the beginning of World War III. That's very possible, but I'm not prepared to make that call right now.
Fair enough. Just if I could get your thoughts on a cautionary point that was made recently by the fifth president of Georgia, Salome Zurabishvili. She said that Russia has learned from the war in Ukraine that there may be less costly ways and more effective ways to take over a country. And she said that Georgia is an example. It's almost like an experiment, she was saying, in how you can manipulate democratic processes against the country and install a proxy, for example. And she says that Putin is trying to do exactly the same kind of thing in Ukraine. I mean, what could be learnt from Georgia, do you think, but also countries like Romania, where Russian interference is also alleged in the presidential elections and failed there?
Sure. Well, I think Georgia is a very interesting case example because here is a country where you had the Russians conduct a conventional military operation against Georgia. They seized a significant amount of territory within Georgia. And then about a decade and a half later, you have a pro-Russian majority and largely Russian captured state, despite Russia having also been the one that conducted aggression against Georgia. It's all the same thing is also true of Chechnya. There was a Chechen secessionist and independence movement in the 90s, but who's fighting in Ukraine now and dying in droves on the behalf of the Russian state? Chechens. if the Russians manage to lock down Ukraine and seize Ukrainian territory, either keep what they have now or maintain what they have, keep going and get more, then guess what? If the Russians decide to attack NATO in the future, who's going to be fighting against NATO? Ukrainians pressed into the Russian military. And so I think that's a valid point. And I think it's going to be very difficult to try to turn Ukraine against Russia because, if you still have Kiev and you still have the Ukrainian civic nationalism that's grown up as a result of this war, which is much stronger than what we had in Georgia, I think Ukraine will be fine. But Russia's tools of influence, their information operations, their political subterfuge, their use of proxies is very effective in many contexts. And, Russia poses really an outsized threat for the resources that it brings to bear.
Your ISW update cites a video address by Putin to high representatives responsible for security issues, which reinforces his vision for Eurasian security. Broadly speaking, what is that vision and what is driving it?
So Putin wants to essentially redo the post-World War II international order. He is not a fan of the so-called liberal, this is a cliche, but liberal rules-based international order. He seeks a multipolar world order. He believes that Western countries like the United States and Great Britain and France, that they have overdue say and play in the international system. And the Russians want to actually be able to control the international system with China and Iran and their clique. But they do it so under the guise of it being an egalitarian system where the global South and the global East and all these other sort of downtrodden other countries are brought into the system, and it's meant to create goodwill with these countries and create buy-in. But of course, the Russians are not really interested in bringing in other countries that are the global South or the global East or these other groups when they are not actually aligned with Russia's geopolitical objectives. It's a very broad and large concept, but essentially, Russia's a revisionist power. They don't like the international rules-based order. And they want to dismantle the current system and create a system of their own where the Chinese and the Russians and Iranians have more global influence.
And just finally, we're talking ahead of these latest negotiations, whatever happens, assuming they do happen in Turkey next week. I'm just wondering what you're going to be looking for and what indicators you're going to be searching for to work out exactly where we are going with this, unless you already have a clear idea.
Yeah, clear things to be looking out for are going to be who are the delegation members that are going to be sent. So are they going to be senior ranking Kremlin officials who actually have the agency and wherewithal to actually negotiate seriously? Or is it going to be like the previous round of negotiations where the Kremlin sends low-level functionaries that are not able to critically engage and make decisions? That will be a very strong indicator in my assessment for the level of seriousness of Russian demands, the level of seriousness of the Russian ability to negotiate. Because if they send low-level functionaries, then we understand that they're just simply wasting Western time again.
Yeah, and then Donald Trump will do what exactly? Because he's repeatedly said, then I'll know if they're serious or not, and then I'll know if they're serious or not. And then he keeps saying the same thing. And at some point, he has to work out whether he knows that or not.
I hope that he makes the right decisions. I think this administration, they're going through the 5 stages of grief for realizing that, in fact, there is no deal to be had, but they're going through each of the 5 stages as slowly as possible. So it's my hope that as they continue to go through this process, that they just sort of, maybe make their way through the final 4th or 5th stage and then realize that they have a decision to make.
And then we'll talk again. George Barros, good to speak to you. Thank you very much.
Good to see you as well, Kate. Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.